Refugees around the world face similar struggles. Though many relate to adapting to a new country in the face of trauma, one struggle for most refugees is learning their host country's primary language. Even if some refugees know a certain amount of that language, as is often the case with English-speaking host countries, a lot of linguistic nuances must be learned to thrive in a country with a different dominant language. Additionally, a significant number of refugees have professional experience in challenging fields, but are unable to enter into those fields in their host countries because they lack the specific vocabulary necessary. Thus, learning language not only enables refugees to survive in their host countries, but it allows them to thrive in their new situations. Learning language is vitally important for refugees. Currently, the world is watching the military conflict in Ukraine. This crisis is creating millions of refugees who are seeking protection in other countries. As this influx of refugees begins, it will be important for language teachers around the world to support Ukrainian learners as they try to learn dominant languages in each of these countries. This is especially important for Ukrainian refugees, as Ukrainians have undergone many different stages of suffering and confusion throughout their language's history. Understanding the cultural and historical context of Ukrainian development, particularly its interactions with other languages, will help teachers better support learning in a manner that does not continue to repress Ukrainian or make it unimportant, but develops a dynamic bilingualism that supports both languages. Though multiple cultural factors impacting Ukrainian could be addressed, three essential factors will be identified for the purpose of this paper. First, Ukrainian has not been given status as a full language by Russian speakers. Often it was and is seen as Little Russian. Second, Ukrainian has gone through multiple revivals and is currently being revived with varying levels of success. Finally, in a blending of the previous two, Ukrainian's use of Russian phrases and loanwords has created a complicated understanding for Ukrainians of what it means to speak pure Ukrainian. Teachers would do well to keep each of these in mind as they begin to receive and teach Ukrainian learners. This research was conducted through literature review. The literature was selected through a broad search for Ukrainian and language, which was then narrowed. The focus centered on the research on Ukrainian's cultural and linguistic interactions. Most of the research focused on Ukrainian and English or Russian. However, there are a couple articles focused on Ukrainian and Polish or Estonian as well. These provided a snapshot of the ways Ukrainian had been impacted in the past and present through these interactions. Through this snapshot, the reality of the cultural context of Ukrainian's development as a language can be understood. As one understands this context, one can see how Ukrainian learners can be best supported as they transition to other countries and contexts. The research presents diverse perspectives regarding Ukrainian and its use on a national and global scale. And each of these discussions tangentially relate to the discussions that this paper will focus on. For instance, the use of Ukrainian and English idioms studied in one paper connect to the theme of pure Ukrainian and how it can be practiced on the modern global sphere. English has had some impact on Ukrainian, and it is important to recognize that that impact is part of the context of learners' desires for their distinct language. Thus, the discussion of the use of English idioms for Ukrainian must be part of the discussion on the impact of other languages on Ukrainian. All other discussions similarly connect to the main discussions as well. The three main discussions of this paper were chosen specifically because they emerged as common themes throughout the research surveyed. Each article, though it may focus on a specific topic, focused on at least one of the three main discussions. Thus, these were threads that could be followed throughout the research. They are important foundational discussions that can be elaborated on in the future. Future research will indeed be necessary to understand each of the tangential discussions, and how they connect to the main thoughts of this paper. Ukrainian has been treated various ways by those in charge of Ukraine. Though portions of Ukraine were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the early 20th century, much of the research relates directly to the actions of the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and Free Ukraine. Each of these rulers of Ukraine has had a different outlook on the Ukrainian language during their era. These eras had a distinct impact on Ukrainians' cultural context. During the time of the Russian Empire, Ukrainian was treated negatively. First, Ukrainian to many Russian elites belonged to the rural spaces, a language of country folk. Additionally, any Ukrainian that moved beyond the rural sphere verged on threatening the stability of the empire. Thus, Ukrainian, or Little Russian as it was well known, was treated negatively by those in power. Ukrainians underwent a process of assimilation through their schools and culture that elevated Russian as the dominant language and the language of prestige. These repressive actions changed with the waning of the Russian Empire in the early 20th century. After the rise of the Soviet Union, policy towards Ukrainians shifted drastically. Since the Soviet Union was built on the principle of equality of all things, Ukrainian was provided a space to develop. However, this decision was not purely benevolent. As Ukrainian was not only supported, it became a vehicle to push the Soviet ideological mindset into the hearts and minds of Ukrainians. This created a somewhat abusive situation with the language, as the language was being manipulated to develop these Soviet ideals. When Ukraine did eventually become a sovereign nation, the ideals of the Soviet Union and Russian Empire left scars on the linguistic landscape. Though Ukrainian is seen as a useful language, there was a dichotomy created within the minds of the people. Many people in the Ukraine actually do not see Russian as a foreign language, but rather part of Ukrainian identity, even going to the point where Russian-speaking Ukrainians feel qualified to evaluate Ukrainian, a language they don't actually speak. Others in Ukraine desire to purge Russian from their collective linguistic consciousness to become more fully Ukrainian. Since Ukrainian has been given space to flourish in recent decades, there have been many efforts to strengthen and revitalize Ukrainian on a national scale. Many support the ideal of Ukrainian becoming a more frequently used language, but this mindset creates many issues. For one, many Russian-speaking Ukrainians state they will speak Russian because they are not skilled at speaking Ukrainian. This raises the questions of how Ukrainian could logically become a singular national language. Another issue that has occurred is the long-standing belief that acceptance of Russian and its influence on Ukrainian is a more enlightened mindset than exclusive use of Ukrainian. Many revitalization efforts do not focus on ridding the country of Russian, but they focus on bilingualism. In the minds of these teachers, Russian, though a source of strain for many people, cannot be completely eliminated. The research indicates that most people see Russian as not quite foreign and that it must be supported in Ukrainian schools. Thus, a system of bilingualism has been developed to support the needs of all the people. In fact, it is a type of non-accommodating bilingualism, where each language is mutually understood. So one person might speak in Ukrainian to another speaking Russian, and they can understand each other. Ukrainian's development shows strength on a more global scale as well. For instance, in neighboring Poland, Ukrainian has become an important mode of communication. It is so prevalent that many signs in Poland are written in both Polish and Ukrainian. This reveals the strength of Ukrainian as a global language. Its speakers are not only willing to work to revitalize it within national borders, but those who speak it outside the country also work to maintain their language. Their language has been maintained so well that it is extremely prevalent in Poland, even more so than certain European languages. As Ukrainian continues to grow as a language of an independent state, there will likely be more places where Ukrainian use will be prevalent enough to impact culture and infrastructure. Within Ukraine, there is also a movement towards the strengthening of Ukrainian. As noted, there is a continual struggle produced by this Russian-Ukrainian dyad in Ukraine. Many Ukrainians feel frustrated with Russian impacting their language and actively work to purify Ukrainian from all Russian influences. One of the most obvious examples of purifying Ukrainian is many Ukrainians' reaction to Shurzik, a Ukrainian-Russian mixture. It is widely looked down upon. It is often not acceptable in a public space. Ukrainian is acceptable, Russian is acceptable, but the blending of two is not acceptable. While it is true that many Ukrainians oppose the use of this blended language, Ukrainians also have an increasing resistance to Russian loanwords in Ukrainian. In a study, a Ukrainian classroom was observed where there was a clear preference for Ukrainian forms of words, even when there was really an option between a Russian loanword and a Ukrainian word that meant really the same thing. While they are wary of these Russian influences, many Ukrainian speakers actually react positively to certain languages of the European Union, as well as English being taught in conjunction with Ukrainian, without concern of the impact on their language. While again, this may be understandable, there is a real danger in this. The languages are often dominating and create a huge impact on any language that they have enough influence on. While Ukrainians are more open to languages like English entering their language, it is important to recognize that there are valuable efforts by many being made to sustain Ukrainian as a unique language. Avoiding excessive loanwords from any language could be a key factor in continuing this work. As Ukrainians enter different countries and begin to set up their lives, they will need to learn the language of those countries. Many Ukrainians enter these countries in a state of fear and loss and must be supported in every way possible. The research reviewed provided an understanding of the different cultural contexts that Ukrainians carry with their language. The context, particularly the three main contexts discussed, must be kept in mind as the countries begin to teach Ukrainians the dominant language, as well as supporting the cultural context of the language, which supports these learners and avoids furthering their suffering. First, teachers must remember that Ukrainian has been treated poorly in the past. Learners may be acutely aware of lessons which downplay the importance of their native language. They are used to those who are in charge seeing their language as Little Russian and may react poorly to Ukrainian being looked down upon. Though it is not something most countries would purposefully do, many cultures with a monolingual ideology consistently implement an understanding of learners' first language that does diminish its importance. Teachers in these countries in particular must avoid falling into that ideology. Many learners may be aware of the use of Ukrainian to promote the ideologies of the countries. The Soviet Union revitalized Ukrainian to teach the ideologies of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, this may connect too closely to the lessons of many teachers who are teaching in the bilingual classroom. There may be many ways to use Ukrainian to help learners to become more comfortable with the culture and language of the host country. While this may not be a problem, some Ukrainians could become frustrated with the use of their language or any language learning to instill ideas of another country. Once again, teachers would often not have insidious motives, but must be careful about the implications of the way they teach, particularly for Ukrainians. As teachers begin to develop their students' proficiency in their second language, teachers would do well to remember how Ukrainian is taught in Ukraine. Bilingualism is important for Ukrainians, but mixed Ukrainian is unacceptable for many learners. This may only be the case when Ukrainian is mixed with Russian, but it may have implications for other languages as well. More study is recommended to fully understand these reactions, but teachers would do well to be cautious of mixing languages in case that does prove uncomfortable for students. Teachers must also remember the frequent use of unaccommodating bilingualism among Ukrainians. Through exchanges where students communicate in different languages, that students continue to learn, even though they seem unnatural and unhelpful to certain teachers. Stopping the practice may lead to more clunky and confused speech, as the learners will feel less comfortable with an unnaturally forced method of communications. There are times when one must speak the language of the host country to learn it. Many Ukrainians will most likely still continue in their mother tongue when interacting with those who understand it. This is perfectly acceptable, especially for Ukrainians who are proficient at a certain level of their host country's language. Truthfully, this use of language should be celebrated in the classroom. Finally, Ukrainians' desire for a pure Ukrainian should be supported in classrooms as well. One way this can manifest involves allowing Ukrainians to use their language as a support tool to learn. One must be cautious about using Russian as a replacement. While Russian is a much more widely spoken language, and thus teachers may have better exposure to Russian, it may be problematic to use with students. While there would certainly be temptation to use Russian to benefit communication in the early stages, this may also create a situation where pure Ukrainian is undermined by the strength of Russian use in the classroom, especially since there are already uses of Russianisms in Ukrainian already. This is not the only scenario, however, and Russian may be able to be utilized effectively. However, teachers must always be careful to remember Ukrainians' desire for their own unique language and recognize and support that. Otherwise, students may close up and react poorly to the lessons. Because Ukrainians' desire for a unique language is so important culturally, teachers must also be careful to support Ukrainian through the impact of the host culture's language. While it is natural that the host language impacts Ukrainian, teachers must be careful not to overemphasize the host language to the point where Ukrainian is overtaken. English especially has been concerning for Ukrainians in the past, with Ukrainians coming into English-speaking countries. And with Ukrainians coming into English-speaking countries, teachers must strive to support the goal of non-excessive borrowing to preserve the uniqueness of their language. Teachers will certainly find that Ukrainian is a unique language, which should continue to have standing as a valuable and important way of communication alongside the host language. As Ukrainians leave their home and go to other places around the world, more considerations regarding learning language in new contexts will certainly develop. This research poses multiple questions still to be answered, as well as which are important to keep in mind. Ukrainians have a long story for their language, full of hurt and triumph. Now, as they enter other nations and communities in a new season of hurt, these nations and communities must work together to understand and engage well with Ukrainian learners of the host language. This is vital for the preservation of Ukrainian as a unique language in different contexts. It is also vital for the well-being and healthy adjustment of Ukrainian learners to their new situation. By understanding the historical control, the bilingual revitalization efforts, and the movement towards pure Ukrainian, teachers will be able to provide safer spaces for their learners. Their learners' success and longevity will be positively impacted. Thus, understanding the cultural context of the language will bring just a little bit of hope to Ukrainians as they struggle with the chaos currently dominating their own country.